The air in the conference room was always set to 68 degrees, a temperature designed to keep people awake and slightly uncomfortable. But on that Tuesday morning, it felt like a freezer. I sat at the long mahogany table, my hands folded neatly over a leather-bound notebook, watching Alina pace at the head of the room. She was wearing the cream suit she reserved for announcements that she believed would be received as gifts, the fabric crisp and expensive, contrasting sharply with the tension radiating off her shoulders. I had known Alina for 10 years, ever since she founded Sterling and Vance and asked me to build the financial infrastructure from the ground up. I was 32 then, fresh out of a forensic accounting program, hungry for proof that merit mattered more than lineage. Now, at 42, I was the chief financial officer, the gatekeeper of every dollar that entered or left this building, and the person who had turned a risky startup into a stable enterprise worthy of acquisition talks. But as Alina stopped pacing and turned to face me, her smile didn't reach her eyes, and I knew the landscape had shifted beneath my feet. She gestured to the empty chair to her right, the seat of power, the seat that should have been mine based on every metric of performance, tenure, and contribution. Julian walked in late. He was 26, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car, with a smile that suggested he had never heard the word no in his entire life. He didn't apologize for being late. He didn't acknowledge the team of senior directors sitting around the table who had been waiting for 20 minutes. He simply slid into the chair, loosened his tie, and looked at his mother with an expectation of adoration. Alina cleared her throat, the sound echoing in the silent room, and began to speak about vision, about legacy, about the need for fresh blood to steer the company into its next phase of growth. She used words like innovation and disruption, but I heard the subtext clearly. She was talking about nepotism disguised as strategy. She announced that Julian was being promoted to Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately. She listed his qualifications, which consisted of a degree from a school his donation had helped build, and a summer internship at a firm where his father was a partner. She did not mention the operational failures of his last venture, the one that had burned through $2 million of investor capital in 18 months without producing a viable product. She did not mention that I had quietly covered the liabilities of that venture to protect Sterling and Vance's reputation, because Alina had begged me to keep it off the books. She did not mention that I was the one who had structured the debt refinancing that saved us from bankruptcy last year. She looked at me, expecting applause, expecting me to stand up and welcome the boy who was now technically my superior in the operational hierarchy, despite having no understanding of the balance sheet he would be responsible for. I did not stand, I did not clap. I simply opened my notebook and clicked my pen, the sound sharp and deliberate in the quiet room. I told them I understood the directive. I told them I would review the organizational chart and adjust the reporting lines accordingly. My voice was steady, devoid of the tremor that usually accompanies betrayal. I have learned over the years that anger is a luxury you cannot afford when you hold the keys to the vault. Anger makes you sloppy. Anger makes you predictable. I felt the heat rise in my chest, a familiar burn that started in my stomach and moved up to my throat, but I swallowed it down, converting it into fuel. I watched Julian smirk, a subtle twitch of his lip that signaled he thought he had won. He thought the title was the prize. He didn't understand that in a company like ours, the title is just vanity. The power lies in the signatory authority. The power lies in the compliance protocols. The power lies in the knowledge of where the bodies are buried. Alina dismissed the room, and as people filed out, avoiding eye contact with me, I remained seated. I watched them pack up their tablets and their notepads, sensing the shift in the air. They knew this was a mistake. They knew Julian was a liability. But they also knew Alina owned 51% of the voting shares, and in a private family company, democracy often ends where the bloodline begins. I waited until the room was empty, until the hum of the HVAC system was the only sound left, and then I closed my notebook. I stood up, smoothed the front of my blazer, and walked back to my office. I did not cry. I did not call my husband to complain. I sat at my desk, logged into the server, and began to work. The history of Sterling and Vance is written in spreadsheets, not press releases. People see the logo on the building and the glossy brochures in the lobby. But I know the company through its cash flow statements and its general ledger. I know that we missed payroll in March of 2018 because Aliner diverted funds to buy a vacation home in Aspen. I know that we paid a settlement to a former vendor in 2020 because Julian's previous company breached a contract, and we had to make it go away to avoid litigation. I know these things because I am the one who signed the checks. I am the one who filed the forms. I am the one who ensured that the Internal Revenue Service never came knocking with questions we couldn't answer. When I built the financial department, I implemented a system of checks and balances that was rigorous, perhaps even overly cautious. I did this because I knew who I was working with. I knew that Aliner operated on impulse and that she viewed the company treasury as a personal bank account. I created a protocol where any expenditure over $50,000 required dual signatures, and any new executive role required a budget allocation approval from finance. It was a standard governance measure designed to protect the company from fraud and mismanagement. At the time, Aliner had signed off on it without reading the details. She trusted me. Or rather, she trusted that I would always be there to clean up her messes. She assumed my loyalty was to her, rather than to the integrity of the institution we had built together. That was her first mistake. Her second mistake was promoting Julian without consulting me on the financial implications of his new role. I spent the rest of that Tuesday afternoon reviewing the employment contract they had drafted for Julian. It was sloppy. They had used a template from a generic HR website, failing to update the clauses specific to our industry's compliance requirements. They had assigned him a budget for his department that was vague, labeled simply as operational overhead, with no line-item restrictions. They had given him authority to hire consultants without prior approval. They had given him access to the corporate credit card with a limit that exceeded my own. It was as if they wanted him to fail, or perhaps they were so arrogant they believed the rules didn't apply to him. I saved a copy of the contract to a secure external drive, encrypted it, and then deleted the local cache. I needed to understand the full scope of what they were asking me to approve. The next morning, an email landed in my inbox from Aliner. The subject line was urgent. It requested my immediate signature on the budget allocation for Julian's new department. They needed the funds released by the end of the week to pay for the consultants he had already hired. Consultants he had selected before he even officially held the title. They were asking me to legitimize a process that had already bypassed every standard protocol. They were asking me to put my name on a document that authorized spending based on favoritism rather than merit. In any other company, this would be a minor administrative hurdle. In our company, with the audits coming up in the fourth quarter, this was a liability. If I signed this, I was attesting that these expenditures were necessary and compliant. If Julian misused the funds, if he diverted them, if he failed to produce deliverables, the signature on the approval form would be mine. I would be the one explaining to the auditors why we paid a consulting firm owned by Julian's college friend $200,000 for a market analysis that didn't exist. I did not reply to the email. I let it sit in my inbox, marked as unread. Silence is a powerful tool in negotiations. It creates a vacuum that people feel compelled to fill. By noon, Aliner had called my office line. I let it go to voicemail. By 2 o'clock, she was standing in my doorway, her arms crossed, her expression tight. She asked me why the budget hadn't been approved yet. I told her I was reviewing the compliance metrics. I told her that the consultant contracts lacked the necessary indemnity clauses. I told her that the budget allocation exceeded the cap for new departments without a board vote. I spoke softly, using the language of bureaucracy to shield myself from her anger. She tried to intimidate me. She reminded me of my position. She reminded me that Julian was now the COO and that I reported to him. I smiled, a thin, polite expression that didn't reach my eyes. I told her that according to the bylaws, the CFO retained independent signatory authority on all financial commitments to ensure fiduciary responsibility. I told her that my duty was to the company, not to the family. I saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had forgotten the bylaws. She had forgotten that I had written them. She left my office without another word, but I knew the clock had started ticking. They needed those funds. Julian had already promised his friends that the checks were in the mail. If the money didn't move, his credibility would shatter before he even started. I had them exactly where I wanted them. I had the leverage, but I needed more. I needed to ensure that when I finally moved, the ground wouldn't just shift beneath them. It would open up and swallow them whole. I began to dig. I spent the next 3 nights working late, long after the cleaning crew had vacuumed the carpets and the security guards had locked the front doors. I went into the archives, both digital and physical. I pulled the files from the server that housed the transactions from the last 5 years. I looked for patterns. I looked for anomalies. I was not looking for mistakes. I was looking for intent. I found the first irregularity in the vendor payments from the previous year. There were 3 invoices from a marketing agency that had no website, no physical address, and no record of deliverables. The payments had been authorized by a leaner, but the work order had been signed by Julian. The total amount was $150,000. I cross-referenced the bank account details for the vendor. It was a shell company registered in Delaware, but the registered agent was a law firm that Julian had used for his personal real estate holdings. It was a classic kickback scheme. They were funneling company money into a private account under the guise of business expenses. It was embezzlement, plain and simple. But it wasn't enough. Embezzlement was a crime, but proving it in a family company was messy. It would lead to lawsuits, to public scandal, to a dissolution of the business that might hurt the employees who had nothing to do with the family's greed. I needed something that would force them to capitulate without destroying the company. I needed a leverage point that threatened their control, not just their freedom. I turned my attention to the loan covenants. Sterling and Vance had taken out a significant line of credit 18 months ago to expand our warehouse facilities. The loan agreement had strict clauses regarding management changes and financial ratios. If the company underwent a material change in leadership without the lender's consent, or if the financial ratios dipped below a certain threshold, the bank could call the loan. Immediate repayment, all of it. I reviewed the recent financial statements. We were healthy, but we were not liquid enough to pay off the entire line of credit without selling assets. If the bank called the loan, a leaner would lose the company. She would have to sell to competitors or declare bankruptcy. I looked at the promotion of Julian again. The loan agreement defined key personnel. I was listed as a key person. My departure, or a significant reduction in my authority, could trigger a review. But the promotion of an unqualified individual to a C-suite role could also be interpreted as a material change in risk profile, especially if that individual had a history of financial mismanagement. I had Julian's history. I had the records of his failed venture. I had the evidence of the kickbacks. I began to construct a file. I didn't organize it as an accusation. I organized it as a risk assessment. I created a document that outlined the potential liabilities associated with the new operational structure. I cited the loan covenants. I cited the compliance gaps. I cited the vendor irregularities. I kept the tone clinical. I used words like exposure, mitigation, and governance. I was not threatening them. I was protecting the company. By Friday, the pressure was mounting. A leaner had called 3 times. Julian had sent me a terse email demanding the approval. The consultants were asking about their payments. The silence from finance was becoming a topic of conversation in the hallways. I could feel the anxiety radiating from the executive suite. They knew I was the bottleneck. They knew I held the pen. But they also knew I was loyal, or they thought I was. They believed I would eventually cave because I cared about the employees, because I cared about the legacy. They were right about the employees. I did care about them. I cared about the 150 people who relied on their paychecks. I cared about the stability of the institution, but I did not care about preserving a leaner's delusion of control. I scheduled a meeting for Monday morning. I invited a leaner, Julian, and the chairman of the board, a retired judge named Arthur who had been a friend of a leaner's late husband. Arthur was the only person on the board who understood the gravity of fiduciary duty. He was the wild card. If I could bring him into the fold, a leaner would be isolated. I sent the calendar invite with a note attached. Review of Q4 budget and compliance risks. I did not mention Julian. I did not mention the embezzlement. I let the ambiguity do the work. The weekend was quiet. I spent it with my family, disconnecting from the phone, letting the tension build on the other end of the line. I needed to be clear-headed for Monday. I needed to be precise. Revenge is not about emotion, it is about execution. It is about aligning the variables so that the outcome is inevitable. On Sunday night, I reviewed my presentation one last time. I had printed the documents. I had highlighted the relevant clauses in the loan agreement. I had prepared the forensic analysis of the vendor payments. I had everything ready. I slept well, knowing that the trap was set. Monday morning arrived with a gray sky and a light rain that tapped against the windows of my office. I arrived early, setting up the conference room. I placed the folders at each seat. I placed a glass of water at my own spot. I wanted them to see that I was prepared. I wanted them to see that I was not acting out of spite, but out of duty. When they arrived, Elena looked tired. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and there were shadows under her eyes. Julian looked annoyed, checking his watch as if my time was less valuable than his. Arthur arrived last, walking with a cane, his eyes sharp behind thick glasses. He nodded to me, a gesture of respect. He knew why he was here. I had sent him a brief summary the night before, just enough to pique his interest without giving away the full scope. He knew there was a risk to the company. He knew I was the one mitigating it. I began the meeting by reviewing the Q4 budget. I walked them through the numbers, line by line. I showed them the revenue projections, the expense ratios, the cash flow forecasts. Everything was normal. Everything was stable. Then I moved to the new operational budget. I placed the folder in front of Julian. I asked him to walk us through the consultant contracts. He stumbled. He didn't know the details. He hadn't read the contracts. He looked at his mother for help. Elena intervened, trying to gloss over the specifics, saying that these were strategic partnerships. I interrupted her. I told her that strategy requires documentation. I told her that without deliverables, these were not partnerships, they were gifts. I slid the forensic report across the table. I didn't say anything. I let them read it. I watched the color drain from Elena's face as she saw the bank account details. I watched Julian's hands start to shake as he realized I knew about the shell company. Arthur put on his reading glasses and studied the document silently. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the projector. When Elena looked up, her eyes were wide with panic. She tried to speak, to explain, to deny. I held up my hand. I told her I wasn't here to discuss the past. I was here to discuss the future. I told her that based on this evidence, I could not approve the budget. I told her that approving it would make me complicit in fraud. I told her that my signature was not available for illegal activities. Julian slammed his hand on the table. He shouted at me. He called me disloyal. He said I was trying to sabotage him. He threatened to fire me. I waited until he finished. I waited until his breathing slowed. Then I spoke again. I told him that he couldn't fire me. I told him that according to my employment contract, which I had renegotiated 6 months ago, I could only be terminated for cause, and cause required a unanimous vote of the board. I told him that Arthur was unlikely to vote for cause given the evidence in front of him. I told him that if they tried to terminate me without cause, the severance package would trigger a liquidity event that would breach the loan covenants. I laid it all out. I explained the domino effect. If they fired me, the bank calls the loan. If the bank calls the loan, the company folds. If the company folds, there is no inheritance left for Julian. I looked at Elena. I told her that I knew she wanted to secure her son's future, but she was jeopardizing the entire enterprise. I told her that I was offering her a way out. I slid a second document across the table. It was a restructuring proposal. It outlined a new governance model. It removed Julian from the operational chain of command. It placed him in a ceremonial role with no signatory authority and no budget control. It restored the CFO's independent authority over all expenditures. It required Elena to recuse herself from any financial decisions involving family members. It mandated an external audit of the previous year's transactions. It was a surrender document. It was a demand for total control of the financial reins. Elena stared at the paper. She looked at Julian, who was staring at the table, defeated. She looked at Arthur, who was nodding slowly. She knew she was checkmated. She could fight me, but it would cost her everything. She could admit to the embezzlement, or she could accept the restructuring. The choice was binary. I gave them 10 minutes to discuss it in private. I left the room and walked out into the hallway. I stood by the window and watched the rain fall on the parking lot below. I felt nothing. No triumph, no joy, just a sense of completion. This was not about hurting them. It was about correcting the error. The company was a machine, and they were introducing grit into the gears. I was the maintenance engineer. I was removing the obstruction. 10 minutes later, Arthur opened the door and beckoned me back in. Alina was sitting in her chair, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. She signed the document. She didn't say a word. Julian didn't sign. He didn't have to. His authority was derived from her, and she had just relinquished it. I collected the signed papers. I thanked them for their time. I told them I would update the bank regarding the management stability to ensure the loan remained in good standing. I told them I would schedule the external audit for next week. I dismissed the meeting. The weeks that followed were quiet. There was no explosion, no public scandal. The transition was smooth, almost bureaucratic. Julian's title was changed to Vice President of Strategic Initiatives, a role with no staff and no budget. He stopped coming to the office regularly. Rumors circulated that he was looking for work elsewhere, but no one asked me about it. Alina retreated from the day-to-day operations. She focused on philanthropy and board relations, areas where she could still exert influence without touching the money. I took over the operational oversight. I implemented the new compliance protocols. I hired an external controller to review the vendor payments. The shell company was dissolved. The funds were recovered through a restatement of expenses classified as a clerical error to avoid criminal charges. It was a clean solution. It protected the company's reputation. It protected the employees, and it protected me. I was no longer just the CFO. I was the de facto CEO. Alina still held the shares, but I held the power. She understood that if she tried to interfere, I had the evidence to destroy her. We had reached a détente based on mutual assured destruction. She needed me to keep the company solvent. I needed her to keep the shares stable. It was a cold partnership, but it was functional. I often think about the nature of power in these situations. People assume power is about loudness, about authority, about the ability to give orders. But real power is quiet. Real power is the ability to say no. Real power is the knowledge that you are indispensable. When they promoted Julian, they thought they were diminishing me. They thought they were replacing me. They didn't understand that I was the foundation. You can change the decoration on the building, but you cannot change the foundation without bringing the whole structure down. I had spent 10 years pouring concrete. I had spent 10 years reinforcing the steel. I knew where the load-bearing walls were. They tried to hang a picture on a wall that couldn't support the weight, and when it started to crack, they came to me to fix it. And I fixed it, but I fixed it on my terms. I didn't seek revenge for the sake of pain. I sought justice for the sake of order. There is a difference. Revenge is emotional, justice is structural. I restored the structure. There were moments in the months following the restructuring where I felt the weight of what I had done. I saw Alina in the hallway sometimes, and she would look away. There was a sadness there, a realization that she had lost her child's respect along with her control. Julian resented me. I knew he did. He would send passive-aggressive emails about budget delays. He would try to bypass the protocols. But every time he tried, the system stopped him. The system I built. The system that required my approval. He learned eventually to stop trying. He realized that the game was over. He found a new startup to play with, using money from a trust fund that Alina couldn't touch. He left the company, and his departure was noted in the monthly newsletter with a single sentence wishing him well. There was no fanfare, no farewell party. He was just removed from the org chart. I remained. I continued to work. I continued to ensure that the numbers balanced. I continued to protect the company from the impulses of its owners. That is the job. That is the duty. Sometimes people ask me why I didn't just leave, why I didn't take my skills to a competitor, why I didn't walk away when they insulted me. The answer is simple. I built this. Not the building, not the logo, but the integrity of it. I couldn't leave it to be dismantled. I couldn't leave it to be looted. It was my creation as much as it was theirs. Maybe more. They provided the capital. I provided the viability. Without me, the capital would have vanished years ago. Without me, The names Sterling and Vance would be a footnote in a bankruptcy court filing. I stayed because I had to. I stayed because no one else could do it. And I stayed because I wanted to prove that merit cannot be overridden by blood. Not permanently, you can delay it, you can obscure it, but eventually the numbers always tell the truth. The office is quieter now. The chaos of the transition has settled into a routine. I sit at my desk, and the view out the window is the same as it was 10 years ago. The city skyline hasn't changed. The traffic moves the same way. But inside, everything is different. The hierarchy has been corrected. The checks and balances are functioning. I receive the budget reports every Monday. I review them. I sign them, or I don't. The power is in the pen. I hold the pen. I think about the women who work in this building. I think about the ones who are overlooked, the ones who are passed over for promotions that go to less qualified men, the ones who are told to be quiet, to be team players, to not make waves. I want them to know that waves can be made. I want them to know that you don't have to scream to be heard. You just have to be right. You have to be indispensable. You have to know where the leverage is. It is not about being aggressive. It is about being accurate. It is about knowing the rules better than the people who think they own the game. I recall the day of the meeting, the look on Alina's face when she realized she had no moves left. It wasn't anger. It was resignation. She knew I was right. She knew that if she fought, she would lose everything. She chose to save what she could. It was a rational decision. In the end, we are all rational actors. We all want to preserve our status. I preserved mine. I secured my position. I ensured that my contribution was recognized, not with a title, but with authority. A title can be given and taken away. Authority is earned. It is built on trust, on competence, on the knowledge that you are the one holding the bridge together. I am the bridge. If I step away, it falls. They know that now. They will not make the mistake of testing me again. There is a satisfaction in this kind of victory. It is not the hot rush of winning an argument. It is the cold comfort of knowing that the system works. It is the knowledge that justice was served not by a judge in a courtroom, but by a spreadsheet in a conference room. It is the knowledge that the truth came out not because someone confessed, but because the data demanded it. I look at the files on my desk. They are organized. They are labeled. They are ready. I am always ready. I keep the evidence. I keep the records. I keep the history. Because history has a way of repeating itself if you don't write it down correctly. I will write the history of this company. I will ensure that the record shows who did the work, who saved the ship, who steered it through the storm. It will not be in the press releases. It will be in the archives. It will be in the minutes of the meetings. It will be in the signatures on the contracts. My signature. Sometimes, late at night, I think about what would have happened if I had reacted differently. If I had yelled. If I had quit. If I had tried to expose them publicly. It would have been a mess. The company would have suffered. The employees would have suffered. I would have been labeled as difficult, as disruptive, as a troublemaker. That is the trap they set for women who fight back. They want you to be emotional so they can dismiss you as irrational. They want you to break the rules so they can fire you for cause. I didn't give them that opportunity. I stayed within the lines. I used their own rules against them. I used their own greed against them. I let them hang themselves with the rope they thought was a ladder. It was efficient. It was clean. It was necessary. I walk through the office sometimes just to listen. I hear the keyboards clicking. I hear the phones ringing. I hear the hum of the servers. It is the sound of stability. It is the sound of a job well done. I stop by Julian's old office. It is empty now. It is being used as a storage room for archived files. There is no plaque on the door. There is no name on the desk. It is just a room. That is what happens when you are not essential. You become expendable. You become memory. I will not be memory. I am structure. I am function. I am the one who ensures that the lights stay on. Alina comes to the office less frequently now. When she does, she knocks on my door. She asks for updates. She asks for advice. She treats me with a caution that was absent before. She knows the dynamic has shifted. She knows that I hold the cards. She knows that I could end her with a single email to the bank. She knows that I choose not to because I am professional. But the threat remains. It hangs in the air between us, unspoken but understood. It is the foundation of our new relationship. Respect based on fear. It is not ideal, but it is effective. I think about the future. The company is growing. We are looking at acquisition offers. I am leading the due diligence process. I am the one who will decide if the price is right. I am the one who will decide if the deal goes through. Elinor wants to sell. She wants to cash out. She wants to secure her retirement. I am reviewing the terms. I am ensuring that the employees are protected. I am ensuring that the legacy is preserved. I am not doing this for them. I am doing it for me. I am doing it because I built this. I have the right to decide how it ends, or if it ends. I have the power. I earned it. I took it. No one gave it to me. They tried to take it away and I took it back. That is the only way it works. You cannot wait for permission. You cannot wait for recognition. You have to claim it. You have to secure it. You have to defend it. The rain has stopped. The sun is coming out through the clouds, casting long shadows across the carpet. I close the file on my desk. I stand up. I have a meeting with the board in an hour. I need to prepare the presentation. I need to review the numbers. I need to make sure everything is perfect. There is no room for error, not anymore. I walk to the mirror in the corner of my office. I check my reflection. My hair is neat. My suit is pressed. My expression is calm. I look like someone who is in control, because I am Monica. I am the CFO. I am the one who approves the budget, and I am the one who decides the future. They promoted her son. Then they asked me to approve the budget. And I did. I approved the budget for his exit. I approved the budget for my ascendancy. I approved the budget for the truth. It was the best investment the company ever made. I leave my office and walk down the hall. The employees nod as I pass. They know. They don't say anything, but they know. They saw the change. They saw Julian leave. They saw Elinor retreat. They saw me stay. They know who holds the power now. It is a quiet understanding. It is a silent alliance. We are the ones who do the work. We are the ones who keep the machine running. And I am their leader. Not by title, but by action. Not by birth, but by merit. That is the only legacy that matters. That is the only revenge that lasts. The rest is just noise. The rest is just history. And I am writing the history. One signature at a time. One decision at a time. One balance sheet at a time. The air in the hallway is cool. The lights are bright. The path is clear. I walk forward. I do not look back. There is nothing back there for me. Everything I need is ahead. Everything I built is here. And I am not letting go, not ever. The pen is in my hand. The paper is on the desk. The ink is dry. The deal is done. I am ready for the next meeting. I am ready for the next challenge. I am ready for whatever comes, because I know how to win. I know how to survive. I know how to rule, and I will.